everybody. Christian Bradley for the Game Institute. Sorry for getting a little bit of a late start today. I was getting Photoshop set up here and trying to get all my little images set up for our lesson. And it took a few minutes longer than I thought. So, we'll get a bigger picture to look at while I talk. And give me just a second here to check everything, make sure our stream is working. Yeah, it looks like it is. Okay. So as usual, if you're in the chat room on the Game Institute site, go ahead and post. Let me know you're there. Yeah, I never know who's watching live. If you're in Facebook, then you can't post, or I don't think you can. I can't see it anyways. But you can go to the Game Institute site if you would like to be a part of the conversation. And it looks like we're all up and running here, so we'll get moving. So we're going to be taking a look at textures basically, but mostly how to save in Photoshop, what the size of the texture means as far as what it's going to look like over in your 3D program, maybe some naming, but we're mainly interested in those different save features that come with texture maps. Now here in Photoshop, I've got a few texture maps just as examples. And I've got all sorts of different formats here going on, and sizes. Don't worry about so much the images, that's just so we have something to look at. But let's take a look at this guy to start with. Now this map here is 512 by 512 pixels long. Let me get a better pointer here. So that means that on the screen at 100% displayed on your screen, it's going to be pretty small. And you can see right now it's showing up as 100% here in Photoshop. So that's how big this is on my screen. Now your resolution on your screen could be completely different. So this could show up as bigger or smaller. It's whatever 512 by 512 pixels is on your screen. Now that whole piece can be really misleading, because every screen's different. And so when you bring this texture map into a video game and somebody's playing it, and let's take consoles out of the conversation for a second, because they're kind of on a locked down resolution anyways. But if you're playing this on a PC, that texture map could be too small, or maybe even it's too large. So I doubt it's going to be too large at 512 by 512, but as an example. So knowing what size you need your texture map to be to start with is really important, because I can't come into this map now and resize it. So if I just come in here and say, oh, let's resize this, we'll do image size. You can see it's 512 by 512. If I was to say, well, I need a 2000 by 48 map, 2048 by 2048, I'll just resize it. Well, the problem is all we did is take the information that was sitting on a 512 by 512 map and we stretched it to fit 4 times that size. So all we did was make it blurry. Now, if I view this image from afar, so we'll shrink it down to about where it was. We're 33. Can we get to 25? There we go, 25. So that's exactly how big it was before I changed the size. Well, in theory, it's going to look exactly the same. It actually does, and it's a little bit blurrier, but you probably wouldn't notice. Now we can zoom in on this, but it's going to be blurrier. Now Photoshop's tried to fill in all that gap of information with pixels it thinks belongs there, and it does a decent job, but you can see it's kind of blurry. So you never really want to res an image up. Now resing an image down is preferable. You're really better off just making the image at the correct size to start with, but rarely do we know exactly what that's going to be all the time. But if you shrink an image down, you're much better off. So building your texture maps bigger than what you might actually need them in the end is probably the better way to go. But you never want to scale them up if you can avoid it. I certainly have had to before, but it's not a good idea. Now, your image, when you are making this for other types of formats, so let's say you're aiming at tablet or smartphones, these guys may be really small because a 512 by 512 texture isn't going to do you any good. In fact, it's probably going to suck up all the memory you have for the entire game. So you can't. You may have to have this be really tiny if you're going to use it on those other platforms. Now, there's all sorts of middleware and tricks, especially on the programming side, to scale textures down. So if you're not sure what size the texture should be, you'd ask your art director, your programmer, lead artist, or whoever. They should be able to tell you. And there are many, many, many routes for creating your texture and getting them to the right size that you eventually need them. You may be saving them out of Photoshop larger than you'll ever need them, and then maybe the game engine reses them down, bitmaps, all sorts of stuff mixed in there that we'll talk about some other time. This texture here is 512 by 512. And if I wanted to scale it up, I would lose a lot of detail in here. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and I'm going to jump over to, I think it's this one, yeah. This one's a Photoshop file, and it is 256 by 256 pixels. It's really small compared to what we would usually be using in video games, but it's a good example of this. Saving as a Photoshop file, now this is for folks that are new to Photoshop. Saving as a Photoshop file is going to take a lot of room on your hard drive. Now, this little guy here, 256 by 256, well, not so much. It's probably a couple megabytes, not a big deal. But we only need to save as a Photoshop file if you want to come back to this file and work on it later. That's something we do a lot, but if you are trying to save space, you can always collapse your Photoshop file down. I'm going to just go ahead and flatten this one. And now that doesn't have all those layers in it. You can see it didn't change at all. It's just the layers. So we basically just told it to kind of smash everything down and package it up for us. And now we can save this as a single image. But once we save it as a single image, we can't go back to the Photoshop layers. If I undo that, if you want to save as a different format other than a PSD Photoshop layer to save these layers, you can save it as a TIFF, and TIFF files will save the layers as well. And some companies are preferable with TIFFs for other reasons. But TIFFs and Photoshop files will save the layers. And again, if you're not familiar with that, the layers are your working layers. So I can turn these off, and they're all the parts that go into making that image. Once I flatten it, I can save it as many more different types of formats, but I can't get those layers back once I save it. So if you're not sure, save it as a PSD and worry about it later. But PSD files and TIFFs are not really preferable to be going into game engines. Max, Maya, Blender will handle them. They're a little bit finicky with those, but you can use them. But you're not going to be bringing them into a game engine. You just need to get the image into the game engine, like this guy. All right, now watch what happens here, and I want to jump back over to this one, and I'm going to turn on my grid here. And I think that's set up, yep. And I'm going to, is snap on, snap to grid. Okay, we've got snap on. I'm going to go ahead and paste this. And if I move this, it should snap into place. Yeah, so there's my grid. It's hard to see the grid, but my grid's just cut once here and once here. A 256 by 256 isn't half the size of 512 by 512. It's 1/4 the size. And I know sometimes with my students, math isn't your best thing. So if you have a 256 by 256 image, it's 1/4 the size of a 512 by 512. And if we start getting into those bigger maps, like 2048 by 2048, well, That's 4 times bigger than a 512 by 512. So those maps can start taking up a lot of room, and they are not the healthiest things when you bring them into your game engines when they get that large. Now, these days we really want the large texture maps, so you might be using them, but there's other tricks we'll deal with later to shrink down the loads times on those maps. All right, so with that in mind, let's turn that guy off. We'll just flatten this. Those numbers that I was throwing around, like 256 and 512 by 512, those are powers of 2, and you want your texture maps to be powers of 2. So as far as the width and the height, you want to stick with powers of 2. Now they can be rectangular or square, that's fine. But if you're not familiar with the powers of 2, it's just you keep doubling. So it's 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 128. We don't tend to use those numbers a lot over on the PC and console side. And then you get into 256, 512 by, or 512, 1028, or sorry, 1024. Get my resolutions and texture sizes mixed up. 1024 and then 2048. And those are the normal size texture maps. So it would be very normal for this to be 2048 by length and maybe 1024 in height. Rectangular is fine, square is fine, but you need them to be in powers of 2 for your game engine to be happy. Otherwise, you're going to be rescaling stuff and you don't want to do that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this one. I don't really need him. All right, so go back to this one, or let's look at this one. Now let's talk about the format you can save these as. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And you'll see that I get all these different formats to choose from. Most of them aren't going to do us much good for video games. So if I go through these real quickly, I'm only going to park on the ones that we can really use. And I'll give you the brief explanations of the ones that I see the most. GIF files, we usually use those on the internet, not so much on anything in video games, but they do capture animation, so they pop up every once in a while. JPEGs are a favorite. Used to not use those very much because of the way the compression was set. Nowadays, that compression can be taken care of. They are the most compressed format, I think, most compressed format. Maybe PNGs are better, but one of the most compressed formats, meaning they're the smallest of the formats. But some game engines, ask your art director if you should be using JPEGs or not. They may not want them because they are compressed. So I have used them in games and been told not to use them in some games. It depends on the game, I guess. Moving down a little bit further, you can see lots of ones that we recognize, but not so much for video games. Here's PNGs. PNGs have really caught on in the last 5 years as a favorite format. I'm not sure why that change took place, but PNGs now are very popular. They are also compressed, meaning they're fairly small. They capture lots of information that we like that we'll talk about later, but PNGs do turn up quite a bit. TGAs are another one that turn up. They are the older format. I used to save everything as TGAs, but nowadays not so much. They are not compressed, so they tend to be fairly large in scale. The reason we like Targas and PNGs, by the way, are because they can capture 32-bit format, meaning your alpha channels can be saved. Again, we'll talk about that later. TIFFs do show up. We just talked about them. They do save as 32-bit formats. They are not compressed, meaning they're really large. So, but TGAs, TIFFs, pings, all will save 32-bit format. Last one, and I skipped it up here, is BMP. And the BMP format will save as 32-bit. Also, you'll notice that's kind of a thing with game textures. We like those 32-bit textures. It'll save as 24-bit and 32-bit. But I have not run into a project where we've been saving as BMP lately. I should mention the DDS format. That does show up every once in a while. That was a format that was trying to catch on many years ago. I believe NVIDIA invented that format. I've never used it in a project, but I do know people who have used it in a project. I don't know much about it, but I guess we should mention it here. Okay. Also, be aware that there are many types of JPEGs here. The JPEG 2000 and the JPEG Stereo I have not been asked to use. Not quite sure what those are used for, but just be aware that we want this JPEG right here, the good old-fashioned JPEG. So, oh, and there are your Photoshop formats as well. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's not your Photoshop format. Your Photoshop format is right here, and that's your PSD right there. Okay. So, if I go and save this as a JPEG, let's save it as a JPEG first. I'm going to jump over here to where I can actually save it. There we go. And I'm going to save this as, we'll just call it test 01. And I'll save it so we can get to this. Now, all this is asking us is how do you want this compressed? We always really want it compressed under the large file setting. There isn't much use in changing this. All we're doing is wrecking the quality of our image map with this. Baseline standard is fine, and I would say, okay, now that's your JPEG setting. Let's go look at the PSD setting. You'll see this has PSD layers over here. So if I was to say this is test 01, and we need to go to our spot to save it. Oops. There we go. And I'll save this as test 1 PSD. Well, we get a new one, maximize compatibility. We want that. That's just so it'll open up on different Photoshops. And now I've saved these layers in that version, the PSD version. Let's go ahead and save it as a TGA. There we go. So this time I'll save it as a TGA or a Targa. And what it's going to ask me here is what resolution do you want to save it as? Well, if we don't have a mask, which I don't in this one, we would save it as 24-bit. If I did have a mask or an alpha channel, I should say an alpha channel. If I had an alpha channel, those extra 8 bits would be used to save the alpha channel. Now that's something we can use for transparencies. It's all good, but don't save it as a 32-bit if you have no reason to. So I'll say 24-bit. Something to remember is now I saved it as a TGA. Even though the layers are showing up here, when I open that, which one is the TGA? This one, I believe. There we go. Oh, here, this is the JPEG. See, no layers. And when I open the TGA, oh, here it is, it's right in front of me. And when I open the TGA, no layers. Won't save the layers with TGA or JPEG. So let's save this as a, let's save it as one more. Let's save it as PNG. That's one that will show up quite a bit. And we'll save it as PNG. You can see PNG gets you a few choices. I tend to always put none under compression here. So again, do whatever you're told to do, but I use none. And we'll hit OK. And now that would be a PNG. And again, you don't get your Photoshop layers with the PNG. Okay, so if we're moving along, let's go look at naming these guys. And let's look at a different one here, one we haven't seen before. So when I name this and I save it, which is important, probably more important these days than it's ever been, I'm going to go ahead and name this, let's say, well, let's do this. Let's make up a reason why we have this. Let's call it a ceiling, and it's a wooden ceiling in a cathedral. How about that? That's where it's going. So what we might name this as something like, and you would have to come up with your own naming conventions, but it might be something like a capital C for all ceilings, and then a name, something like Wood C 01, whatever that might be, a wood ceiling 01, and then underscore. Now this is a diffuse map we're looking at because that's a color map, and I might do something like underscore D. And the reason we would do that is that when we bring this into our other programs like Quixel or Substance, a lot of those will look for the naming of the file. Now, how I would usually name this would be something simple like woodco1 underscore D, and that underscore D will tell something like Quixel that that's a diffuse map, and it would know where to put it automatically. It would automatically load it because of that last little piece on there. Let's go ahead and save this. And then let's say this was a normal map. I'm just going to convert this real quick. I'm not going to deal with the settings at all. And let's save this as what a normal map would look like. I'd just put an N after it, something like that, underscore N, and we would save that. I probably wouldn't be saving it as a JPEG, but oh well. And now when I open up Quixel, it would auto-load those maps into certain slots. So if you're going to be using a program that auto-loads texture maps, and just assume you are, I guess that's the safe way to do it, because you don't know what you're going to be using in the future. So it's a good bet. Then you can go ahead and just underscore D for diffuse maps, underscore N for normal maps, underscore S for specular maps, underscore G for gloss maps. You get the idea. So it's a good way to name it. Now, what your other naming conventions are, you'll usually be given those when you're working on a project. In fact, it's one of the first things that is come up with in the pre-production process. And then you'll stick with that all the way through production. What you don't want to be doing is changing your norm or your texture map naming convention halfway through. That can really start causing problems when you're using sorting programs, when you're looking for maps in your game engine, all sorts of reasons. But I think every project I've worked on has had a different naming convention. So texture maps, lots of different things to take into account when you're saving them, when you're deciding on the size, the format, and how to name them. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Okay. So we are still here, actually. That wrap up was because I was taping the screen, recording the screen for that. So give me a second to get these guys wrapped up and in the right place, and check the boards and see if anybody's left a message. Doesn't look like there's any messages today, so that will wrap things up for today. Tomorrow, by the way, the calendar is now set for the next week of streaming videos. I just got that up before we started recording today, so if you missed it, it is there now. And tomorrow, I think we're talking about basic commands in Photoshop. It'll be real beginner level. So if you're just learning Photoshop, tomorrow is the time for you. And that will be on at 2 o'clock Pacific time. I think that's 10 p.m. Is that right? I think that's 10 p.m. GMT time. So, thanks for watching, everybody. See you later. Bye-bye.